Welcome, everybody. And Yelena, please take the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so pleased to be here along with Ambassador Böcklin to kick off this important series. So I'll start by thanking the Swiss Consulate and Mona Sloane, senior researcher at our NYU Center for Responsible AI, for organizing it. As part of a global university focused on research and collaboration, I'm very proud to be facilitating this type of transatlantic dialogue, especially on a topic as timely and as far reaching as the potentials and pitfalls associated with AI. It couldn't be a more appropriate subject for us here at NYU Tandon because we've long been dedicated to research, education, and discussion on technology and its interaction with society. The Center for Responsible AI was launched here specifically to engage in interdisciplinary exploration and delve into ways in which society and technology intersect with one another, particularly in Tandon's areas of research excellence, which include data science, AI and robotics, sustainability, and health. An important part of our mission is something we call engineering opportunity. And while it means making sure our school provides an inclusionary and welcoming environment for all, it goes really well beyond that. It truly extends to our research itself with the aim of enhancing democratic systems, increasing accessibility in transportation and other everyday human experiences, and of course, identifying and removing biases from tools that utilize AI, which is what we're doing with the help of Mona and her colleagues at the Center for Responsible AI. Mona, I'll just mention here, along with being a senior research scientist at the center, is also an adjunct professor in Tandon's Department of Technology, Culture, and Society, where she spearheaded a new and very popular class called AI in Society. So in addition to helping build an equitable and socially sustainable ecosystem of AI innovation, as the center's mission states, she's helping educate the next generation of industry leaders, technologists, and policymakers who will be keeping it going. Let me close by extending a very warm welcome to our panelists and our many attendees, and I'm sure we'll all be gaining valuable insights today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yelena. I really appreciate this very warm welcome. And please let me introduce Ambassador Markus Berlin, who will welcome us from the Swiss side.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to do so. Dear Professor Kovacevic, Dean of the NYU Tandon School of Engineering, dear distinguished speakers, dear Dr. Sloane, today's host moderator for our discussion, and dear participants of today's kickoff event. Digitalization and new technologies, such as artificial intelligence and blockchain, offer opportunities for everyone. And greater use of technology can enhance efforts for more peace and security, prosperity, and sustainability. However, the digital transformation also presents big challenges and risks for people, the economy, society, and democracy. It increases complexity and dependencies and can threaten the security of individuals, companies, and governments beyond national borders. Privacy is under pressure. Working life is undergoing radical change. The influence of individual companies is growing, and new technologies are at times being misused by states and private actors. Digitalization is a priority of Switzerland's foreign policy. Switzerland is home to world-renowned universities and research institutes in the area of artificial intelligence, located in all language regions of the country. Being a world-class leader in innovation and with this proximity to cutting-edge research, as well as the stable political and economic environment, are important reasons why many global tech companies conduct their research from here. Switzerland has a vision of a free, open, and secure digital space and works to reduce the associated risks and threats. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics offer tremendous opportunities to promote prosperity and sustainable development. But there are also major challenges. However, as it raises also complex ethical and legal questions in various fields of application. Switzerland has an ambitious objective in terms of digitalization. Thanks to its consensus culture and its tradition of good offices, It is positioning itself as a mediator in a new and difficult environment, the development of appropriate regulation for the digital space. In this respect, Switzerland also cultivates its host state tradition. It intends to draw on the key role of International Geneva to become the global center for digital governments, with global inclusive discussions like today between experts from the US and Switzerland. Both countries being highly innovative, this transatlantic dialogue will be particularly interesting. As we all know, deploying cutting-edge technology, including artificial intelligence, for good causes does not happen just like that. To make it a reality, we need to work together towards a common set of goals. When I say together, I mean the private and public sector, academia, the civil society and the economy, engaged in an inclusive discussion that helps to hear different perspectives and to learn from each other. That's the goal of this series. Or, as a famous economist Peter Drucker said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. I would like to thank the Center for Responsible Artificial Intelligence at NYU Tandon School of Engineering for this collaboration. And thank you also to our promotional partner, SwissNext, and to my team at the Consulate, namely the Swiss Business Hub, who is at the same time a promotional part of that series as well, for organizing this series. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Dean Kovacevic, Ambassador Berlin. I really appreciate the time you take to be here in this transatlantic space with us, and it's a real honor for me to be here today as well. And I want to thank as well the Swiss Consulate General in New York City for doing this with us. We're extremely thrilled, and the team has been fantastic, and I hope you can feel the energy building. So from me as well, a very warm welcome to all of you, and of course to our stellar panel. My name is Mona Sloane. I'm a sociologist. I do research on artificial intelligence design and policy at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. And before I introduce my distinguished guests today, please be reminded that this event is being recorded. It is not live streamed, it is recorded so that we can later put it on our website. Please let me also acknowledge that I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, and I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, with this inaugural AI Here and There event, we want to map out how on both sides of the Atlantic, AI is already a part of our everyday life. And let me tell you, there could not be a better Swiss-US team to start unpacking this. So while we try to do that in our conversation, please remember that there is no clear definition of artificial intelligence as of yet. Although the idea of sentient machines can first be found in the Homer's Iliad, actually, and that the fact that AI started as a field to concretely materialize with the infamous Dartmouth Conference of '56, we are still not really sure what AI can and should mean. Without wanting to crudely simplify AI, I think we can say that what we mean by AI today are technical systems that analyze data in order to make a prediction that then serves as the basis for making a decision. For example, predicting what the next word in a sentence will be as you type into your phone, and based on that decision, and based on that prediction, make a decision as to what word will actually be suggested to you. This is a matter of calculating the probability of an event occurring. So really what we're dealing with is math. This has very little to do actually with a sort of general artificial intelligence that we know from the Hollywood movies. What is important to remember is that AI systems are increasingly intervening into our social fabric. They are deployed to autonomously or semi-autonomously make decisions that have big impacts. Whether or not you get a loan, if you get into college, if you get that one job you really want, if you are released on bail, and more. So it is ever more important that we engage in a dialogue on it, and I'm thrilled that we are doing this across the big pond. Now, without further ado, please welcome to the panel, Ruman Chowdhury, Ninyani Pevkin, Avi Bernstein, and Oscar Romero. Ruman Chowdhury is a data scientist with a PhD in political science and has led Accenture's efforts in responsible AI for a few years. She then founded a company focused on AI auditing and very recently moved into a director role at Twitter, where she leads the machine learning ethics, transparency, and accountability team. Ninyane Pefkin is the managing director of the Swiss Digital Initiative, a long-term sustainable process that safeguards ethical standards in the digital world through concrete projects. It is headquartered in Geneva and was initiated by the cross-sector association Digital Switzerland under the patronage of Federal Councillor Uli Maurer. Ninyane is also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Shapers community and Voraus, a think tank on foreign policy. Welcome, Ninyane, to New York. Joining us also from Switzerland is Avi Bernstein, who is a full professor of informatics at the University of Zurich, where he focuses on various aspects of the semantic web, recommender systems, data mining, and machine learning, crowd computing, and collective intelligence. His work is based on both social science and technical foundations. I always find this very exciting. He's also a founding director of the University of Zurich's Digital Society Initiative, a university-wide initiative with more than 180 faculty members investigating all aspects of the interplay between society and digitalization. And then also joining from the doorstep is here from New York City, Oscar Romero, who is a program director of the New York City Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer, where he focuses on building innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystems to address urban inequality across New York City by leveraging civic engagement, emerging technology, and international cooperation. He oversees the design, management, and evaluation of global multi-stakeholder partnerships to address diverse urban development challenges in the US' largest urban economy. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining. Now, before I hand over to the wonderful panelists, just a few words in housekeeping. We will be having a panel discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. Throughout the conversations, please put your questions into the Q&A chat, and please indicate who the question is for, and I will then ask them a little later. Now, delving right into it, I'm going to throw it over to Texas, to Ruman. And Ruman, I want to ask you, for many years, in your previous role at Accenture and now in your new role at Twitter, you have worked at the intersection of AI and society. Now, in your opinion, what are the three most important and dynamic ways in which AI already plays a role in our daily lives?
Yes, so that's only three, huh? I think what's important, one important distinction to make in the way it's influencing our lives, the first one I would say are the seen and unseen ways. There are some very direct interactions we have with, let's say, computing systems or decisioning systems that we are very aware that there are decisions being made. I think equally important is to think about all the ways in which we do not know that they are impacting us. So this could be, for example, a company creating a customer score using an artificial intelligence risk or assessment system based on your prior shopping history and maybe some data they've bought. So I think that would be the first lever that I would think about. The second is in the kind of everyday decisioning that has integrated into our daily lives. So smart everything. And this persistent sort of surveillance, data collection and tracking. And what I point out there is kind of this notion of collecting data for data's sake. And what's interesting to draw from that is in the data privacy space, we have a notion called data minimization and data reciprocity, which are two things that do not carry over into the AI space. Often you find people just collect data with no real understanding or intent of how they're going to use it, but they just know it might be useful later. That is the second. And the third, I would say, in the realm of, in the role that I'm in today, thinking through how AI shapes our perceptions of the world. So this could mean social media. This could mean also many other things. Every news website you go to has some sort of recommendation system, curation system. Users like you were interested in reading X. So thinking through the ways in which we are part of shaping our own filter bubble, but also how algorithms shape and define the world around us.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's a very important distinction between, do we actually realize we're interacting with a system, or are we not? Do we not realize that we're interacting with an AI system? And I actually asked that question yesterday to a bunch of undergrad students, like, what is the first moment in the day that you interact with an AI system, you think? And it's actually, if you check your social media in the morning, it's literally the moment you wake up, because we have these recommendation algorithms that you just spoke about. But Avi, I want to throw it over to you in Switzerland and ask you, from your experience, both as an individual, as a person, but also as a scholar who works across these kinds of issues, who has lived in different places, with a PhD from MIT, worked at NYU, now back in Switzerland. You have a real view for AI here and there. And I would love to hear from you about the different cultural approaches that you sort of see emerging, or that you observe between Swiss and US American approaches to AI in society, or even more globally.
Right, thank you very much for that question. I think it's important to recognize that technology and society develop together. It's not like we're, technology is being thrust on us and then we have to kind of carry it and we have to live with it. But there is a kind of an interaction between the way we interact with technology and the way technology then gets further developed by the developers. And sometimes, one good example that is being researched here at the university in Zurich is that we have a whole project that looks at how the digitalization has changed the way people, interact with their religion. So, people use, definitely over the last year with the pandemic, have used more electronic means to interact, worship and interact with their religion. And that has, again, changed their way they relate to it. And it has changed the way, congregations employ technology. So you get this interaction. And once you realize that this interaction is in place, you automatically also see that technology will develop differently in different cultures. A second good example to take this is a famous publication in Science said that semantics, so meaning derived automatically from language corpora, will contain human-like biases. So if you take this, if you derive semantics from human-like biases in texts here in Europe or somewhere else, you will get the biases that are available or are predominant in that society. So you'll get changes. And just to give you some very simple examples that will make this very clear, I think the one excellent example is when I came to the US to join grad school 20 odd years ago, we had this concept called the brown bag lunch. You're going to say, yeah, we are in one right now, right? And, grad students would take some pizza and munch on their pizza while somebody was speaking. That was unimaginable for me as a person coming from Switzerland. It was rude to munch on a pizza while somebody was giving a talk. And now I see some people laughing. It's like, what, rude? If you now take and you write a piece of software that will schedule a presentation automatically based on observation, and you train it on US data 25 years ago and apply it in Switzerland 25 years ago, it would schedule a bunch of rude presentations. Whereas vice versa, people in the US would ask themselves on a system that was trained on Swiss data, why didn't it choose the lunch spot? That's when we have our talks. And I think that's important to see, that when we have technology that gets developed in a place and or trained on data that comes from a place, it will pick up on the cultural ambiguities and on the cultural side effects that are there. And if you then export it to other places, you will export culture, just the way we do it with many other things. So I think that is an important thing to understand. So when we talk about AI in the international settings, we always need to ask ourselves, where was it trained? Who trained it? What were their stances toward that? Did they think about the cultural differences that may arise? And what about the importing and the exporting of this across cultural boundaries? I think those are the most important issues that I would pick up on and kind of think about.
Thank you so much for that, Abby. I might actually steal that example for class. That was wonderful. The route scheduling software, that's really, truly great. But speaking of sort of cultural differences and sort of maybe also cultural differences in terms of understanding harms and issues around artificial intelligence, Liliana, I want to throw it over to you and ask you, as the director of the Swiss Digital Initiative, and as also somebody who has a policy background, who has a lot of policy experience, you're really focused on the more thorny questions and issues around artificial intelligence. And you are particularly focused on putting ethical values and principles into practice. So fixing the root scheduling software in a way. How do you do that currently in your work?
So thank you, Mona, for this question. And also thank you for having me here. It's great to be back in New York, at least virtually. So yes, this notion of putting ethical values and principle into practice is actually not an invention of the Swiss Digital Initiative. There are a lot of organizations that are already trying to pursue this huge ambition, but it was the reason why the Swiss Digital Initiative was created, because we saw that there is actually a gap between theory and practice. A lot is talked about the different principles, the digital ethics that should go into practice, but the big question, and I think a lot of thinkers and doers and organizations are trying to resolve this question, is how can we bring digital ethics into the business practice as well. And that's why the Swiss Digital Initiative, a foundation based and headquartered in Geneva, was created in 2019, with also the aim of building trust and strengthening the responsibility for individuals and organizations. And we actually have chosen a very pragmatic approach. So we said that we want to implement new projects. And the first project we are currently pursuing is the creation of a so-called digital trust label. So with this digital trust label, we actually want to give users of digital services more information and transparency on these digital services. For example, are my data treated in a responsible manner? Or as Ruman just mentioned, to make the invisible algorithms visible so that the users know if there's an algorithmic decision being taken, and if so, is there someone I could turn to which could verify this decision if I would not agree with it. So to make this more visible and to help users also navigate in this digital jungle.
The digital jungle. Thank you so much, Liliana, for that notion as well. Speaking of more concrete steps and speaking about sort of citizen engagement and literacy and equity, Oscar, I would love to hear from you as someone who is really confronted with having to find the potential of applied technologies such as artificial intelligence to address very concrete needs and problems, both within local government and sort of administrative units, but also for citizens, and with a mission to increase equity here in New York and to protect the most vulnerable. How do you engage with local communities and conversations about artificial intelligence? And how do you do that in a way that really encourages and supports citizen action?
Well, thank you so much for this question. And I think I want to start with bringing Professor Bernstein's analogy to the context of New York City, because I think that's the beginning, right? The same analogy that you could make for different countries, you could actually make for different neighborhoods here. With 40% of the population coming from different places in New York City, and very, very strong class, ethnic discrimination processes that the city has been subject for years and years and years. If you train any algorithm or any process on any given cultural practices on a neighborhood and then try to make something for the entire city of New York, that will generate a number of inequalities. And I think that for many, many years, the voices that were heard the most on these subjects were not necessarily those of the people that were living on the more vulnerable conditions. And so the first element that we do is we try to do a civic engagement process that does not simply ask a question and ask people to raise a hand, but rather we go to neighborhoods that have been systematically discriminated through a variety of reasons, whether it was redlining in the 60s, discrimination in terms of access to critical infrastructure, whether that may be broadband, that may be access to healthcare, to education, whatever it might be. And then we try to identify community-based organizations that can speak to the realities of folks living in those neighborhoods. Because the truth is that there's a lot of romanticization when we talk about civic engagement. We think, oh yeah, somebody wakes up one day and feels like understanding and engaging in how the city makes policy decisions about transportation. And the truth is that when you're talking about vulnerable populations, they're busy. They have 2 jobs, they have things to do. And if they go and engage with the city, it's because something is so fundamentally broken that they cannot continue to do what they need to do to survive. And so that is a completely different framework from which to depart. And I think when we talk about AI or any technology or innovation for that matter, it's very important that we don't start there. We start with the problems. What are the problems that people are facing? And so that's the first lever of engagement, de-romanticizing, making sure that the who we engage can actually speak to the realities of those we're trying to serve. And then the second element is identifying what are the government levers. What are the things that within the public administration, within a municipal government, we can actually do for the players, what has been done. And very concretely, are the problems that do the problems that we're identifying, do they have a layer that can be addressed through AI and ICTs? Because not everything can be addressed. And certainly, even if you find a data collection problem, a communications problem, an automation problem, a data processing problem, how that issue is embedded in a human chain of action matters a lot. So do the people who actually have the job to address the different pieces have the capacity to do so? And so once you find answers to all those questions, that may lead to different forms of action. It may be that you want to do an open innovation challenge to bring entrepreneurs to address a thing in a way that was not addressed before. It may be that you do capacity building to create more open and transparent data. It might be that you need to put policies forward because the ways in which things are happening in a given neighborhood are not fair, equitable, or put a lot of people in different stress and situations. So depending on the action, it always goes back to the community. And that's when it gets interesting, because then you have an opportunity to offer back to the neighbors, and you must, the different ways in which you can address a problem. And then your goal at that point is building their capacity to advocate for what they think is the best thing for the community, right? And I will say, to give you concrete examples, we were working in England, Washington Heights, which is in the northern part of Manhattan, here in New York City, about 200,000 residents, 75% of them Latino. One of the big challenges they had was displacement. They were afraid of being of the development of new buildings. We're gonna end up displacing them. And as you know, political power in the United States has to do with geographic representation. You displace a community, in this case, most of them Dominican, to different places, and then the political representation also gets dispersed or disappears. And so what we try to understand is how tenant harassment was happening. And we found a number of different softwares or AI technologies that nonprofits had created to identify what places were most likely to displace their tenants based on data that they had, to then allow community organizations to use their limited resources to take action. So for us, then the challenge was, how do we find places that enhances the work of these nonprofits, that allows residents to take action when they face challenges? But as I said, the starting of the conversation could have never been that fruitful if we come there and try to talk about technology rather than talking about displacement and housing problems, which is what they were afraid of.
Thank you so much for that, Oscar. That was a fantastic sort of overview of what's happening in New York City, and also the complexity of the city and really any kind of social space, and how you approach it with a view for what is the problem that this technology sets out to solve, and what is the social backdrop and the history of that. I really appreciate that. I want to move this into a slightly more technical space and throw it to Roman. And Roman, ask you about the notion of digital literacy. Oscar has spoken about this a little bit and very nicely connected that to sort of sociopolitical literacy, effectively. We talk a lot about digital literacy in the context of creating ethical AI, in the context of making AI more democratic because it supports citizen engagement. What do we mean by that technically? What does that mean for different people? And how do we connect that to things like explainability and transparency in machine learning and AI?
That is such an excellent point, Mona, and thank you for raising it. Oscar, I also really do appreciate your nuanced discussion of what public engagement means. I think it's almost become like a reflexive fallback for, frankly, people in positions of power to say, oh, we're going to engage the public. And there are a couple of things that are often missing from that narrative. Number one is agency, and then number two is literacy. And Oscar, I think you talked really beautifully about this notion of agency. How do we empower people? So in terms of the digital literacies, I've thought quite a lot about this because so much of what companies have been trying to do in different organizations, civil society organizations, is educate people. And we use this term, education, literacy, et cetera. So there's this really wonderful book, and I wish that I was the one that discovered it, but it was recommended to me by Chris Wiggins, who's at New York Times, as well as in Columbia, and it's called Multiliteracies for a Digital Age. Interestingly, it's written by an English professor, and also interestingly, it was written in 2005. And it is, in a sense, about the pedagogy of computer science and digital literacy, but it kind of applies more broadly. And in an effort to not poorly paraphrase or take too much time talking about it, there are different levels of digital literacy, and it is a function of your role in shaping it and interacting with this kind of technology. So the folks who are the developers need to have a more critical understanding of the technology and also the ability to interrogate and develop it in a post-interrogation, because in a sense, they're the ones that hold the most power and agency and autonomy over the system. But then you get to users, and and maybe I'll take a more corporate perspective and say, at Twitter, for example, we have user researchers, and they understand people who are interacting with the platform. How can a system be designed such that a user is able to critically understand and interrogate the system in a way that makes sense for the level of ability and skill that this user has? So part of that is good design, good interactivity, but also literally creating the engineering pathways of agency. And I'll give you a more specific example. GDPR forced a lot of companies to create the kinds of databases, the kinds of accessibility, the kinds of, even if it's something like an email address or Teams, to address issues of data ownership and privacy at literally every company that has a European footprint. And that's really critical because it was not just that people are empowered magically, it's that companies needed to actually put these systems in place, but then people had the ability to ask the right kinds of questions. So it's a really fascinating book. As I mentioned, it focuses more on the pedagogy of computer science, but I think it is interesting to think about the interplay between like the social dynamics, Oscar, as you've mentioned, but also the technical tools that one can build in a way that speaks to the level of acumen, time, and resources of the individual interacting with it.
Thank you for that, Ruman. And that, of course, is also something that we're very concerned with at Tandon as we are working towards integrating ethics and social science scholarship and thinking into the engineering education. And which is really exciting. And it seems that the students, at least, which is also a particular demographic, of course, are very excited about that work and are doing fantastic projects in that domain. But Ninyana, I want to ask you, again, as somebody who works with this concretely, and also as somebody who today is representing Switzerland. And I will say that one of the conversations we've been having early on when we were planning this series was about direct democracy and sort of direct engagement. And there is a tradition of that in Switzerland. So I want to ask you, in Switzerland particularly, are there any initiatives that are focused on creating literacy among the public and focused on specifically addressing ethical challenges and impacts of AI?
So yes, so first let me start with what you already mentioned. I believe that democracy in itself is probably the best tool to enhance digital literacy. And Yeah, we have the privilege in Switzerland to vote at least 4 times a year on a federal level on different policies. And for example, we voted some weeks ago on a new EID law. And the discussions previously to this vote and the debate actually really enhanced a fact-based debate. And I'm sure a lot of people who never before thought about what happens with my data, or who is responsible for my data, etc. They first started to ask themselves, these questions. So on a more broadly level, I believe that democracy in itself is the best tool. However, in Switzerland, we have various organizations working towards addressing these challenges of digital literacy. So we have smaller organizations, for example, an NGO called Algorithm Watch. They are observing automated decision-making systems and their impact on society. Then we have the so-called digital days in Switzerland. So Digital Switzerland, the Association on Digitalization, are organizing every year some days where the public is being involved, engaged in various formats. So from learning labs to discussions, debates around digitalization, new technologies such as AI, their challenges and opportunities as well. And it's now even, these digital days are even taking place in other countries such as Germany and Sweden. And overall, I think we are at the very beginning of this transformation, and there needs to be an educational effort on various levels, of course, in schools, at universities, but more than that, I think it needs not just the skills and the competencies, but some sort of a change of mindset and a change of culture, because sometimes I have the impression we talk of two separate worlds, so the digital world and the analog world, but actually it's becoming all the same. We're living now in a very interconnected world, and we need to know how can we navigate in this interconnected world. And one point I always also miss in these discussions around new technologies such as AI, I think AI is not a mean in itself or an end goal in itself, but it should actually serve a higher purpose and should make our life better in a broader sense, more convenient, more connected, more meaningful. And yet through the pandemic, we are so interconnected and at the same time drifting also more and more apart. So I believe digital literacy is not just a nice to have, but becoming really an urgency. And Switzerland, but other countries have to step up their game with regards to that aspect.
Thank you so much for that, Nina, and I really appreciate that. Oscar, you kind of also spoke about what Nina just raised, the connectedness between a real place and the digital place, and how, particularly in New York City, that plays out. Now, New York City also is a place that is kind of really pushing the frontier a little bit when it comes to tech regulation, citizen engagement. You guys are doing a lot of work around that. How do you do that with a view for reducing inequality, particularly in the context of the pandemic? And again, Nina just raised that in a way we're more disconnected. And of course, New York City is a place that has been severely affected by the pandemic. How do you think about rebuilding the digital/physical city with AI, with these kinds of systems, with a view for equity?
I think there's a couple of approaches that the city is taking, and in part, I will say the reason why we have been able to respond to the pandemic is because these strategies have been in place for a long time already to address inequality. So one of the key elements is agency capacity building, increasing the ability of the actual government apparatus to address these issues. One way is certainly through a new position that we generated in 2019, the algorithms management and policy officer, whose job was pretty much to take a look at everything the city agencies were doing and making sure that any application of technologies, algorithmic tools, or systems were fair, transparent, human-centered, were protecting privacy, that we had an auditing process to make sure that we were on the same page about the values that we wanted to put forward for the systems that we used. But you had other players that were already working on the foundations of what using these technologies to address inequality means. For instance, the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics that has been working for years, creating open data systems, making more transparent the government, making sure that the actual data that we put out there in our open data portals, people can use. And then you have folks like the Economic Development Corporation who are working on developing industries. And that's one of the key ways to address inequality, I would say, by opening pathways for entrepreneurship to people that are more diverse, by working with universities to fund research and to make it available for those who cannot put 1,000 times because they have a lot of resources to actually be part of these industries that profit from New York. And then I would say the job of our office is around identifying particular problems and then creating pathways to apply technology to address that inequality specifically, whether it is in protecting tenants from harassment. To give you two quick examples of what we did during COVID, in the same community I'm talking about in Washington Heights, most immigrants before the pandemic, in the context of the Trump administration, had a lot of different mental health problems. Just imagine what it was like to be a young teenager afraid of somebody in your family being deported and everything you had to put in place to know that. The roles that people have to take when they have to translate for their parents and so on. So the two issues that we were addressing were mental health and tenant harassment prevention. When the pandemic hit, surprise, the problems of those who are in vulnerable situations continue to be the same, just exacerbated. And so we had the infrastructure to actually put in place different initiatives to provide services. And I guess something interesting to say is sometimes it's not about what is the most sophisticated technically, but rather about what can get something done today, even if it is like a little thing, that can then become the building blocks for something more complicated that can go at scale later. The last thing I will say that I find interesting when combating inequality through AI is a lot of large organizations have the ability to leverage AI to scale operations. So if they do something that is ethically questionable, the process of doing it is going to allow them to become bigger. Whereas a lot of folks in government and nonprofits leverage AI to maximize limited resources. It's a very different framework where you try to do the best you can with what you have, but you are not able to go to the same scale that others will go when they're profiting from what they're doing. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have ahead.
Thank you for that, Oscar, and I really appreciate your introduction of the idea of AI as a scaling technology, which is kind of something I also work on in my own work, and I think that's very important to bear in mind. You know, to what end are we scaling, right? And what are the motivations behind that? So thank you for that. Avi, you're building tech and you're doing research on tech, and you also have a view for the different kinds of regulatory approaches that we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, in your opinion, what are the best ways forward for regulating AI in a world where there are many different opinions about what the trade-offs can should be between opportunities and risks? And how do you go about that in your own work?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question that if I would have a answer I could give you in a minute, I would be writing it up and sending it to a good journal as well as publishing it publicly. The problem is actually quite subtle and complicated at the same time. I think at first, what we've seen emerge is a bunch of ethics guidelines, and the nonprofit mentioned before actually has a website that tries to accumulate all the ethics guidelines around AI. And you will see it's a long list. It's a very long list of ethics guidelines. So I think that's a very important first step to kind of think about what are actually our ethical decisions that we make about what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages, what are the opportunities and what are the risks that come up when you use technology. So that is kind of a first step. I think, however, a second step is that we need to ask ourselves, how can we legislate, what we think AI should be allowed to do and AI should not be allowed to do. And I mentioned it in my first statement that this is something that will have a dependency on your normative beliefs in your culture. You know, some people have some beliefs in some environments and some cultures, and others have others. And that's why laws in different countries are different. So these trade-offs will have to be discussed in the public and with public engagement, as was just mentioned, in different countries. Now, what are the means for doing that? I had the honor and pleasure to work with the Council of Europe and a set of guidelines on how AI will impact human rights. And I learned a lot of things about these regulatory mechanisms. First of all, the Council of Europe, for those of you who don't know, the Council of Europe is an organization that is essentially the holder of the European Convention of Human Rights. It is not it is independent of the European community. So Switzerland is a member of the Council of Europe. And so the focus on human rights showed me that it was very important to think, when you regulate AI, of the application area. I will have completely different feelings about AI intervening in my medical process than in presenting opportunities of what I should watch next on a streaming website. And so the application will very strongly interact with the kind of regulation that I would expect. The second part to recognize, and I think that's also very important, we've spoken about the GDPR. Ruman mentioned the GDPR, the data protection regulation of the European community, which has truly changed the way people engage with each other on many levels. Is that AI regulation is not data protection regulation. It's something else. I can be completely compliant to the GDPR and still do things that some people may believe are not to be done. So we should not put on our GDPR, binoculars, but we should actually think differently. And let me just give you one examples for that. GDPR tries to prevent harm ex ante, right? It's the data sparsity that was mentioned. You should not collect any data that nobody has agreed to collect or that could induce harm. But there is another perspective. You could also regulate AI by saying, we don't care about the actual process, we care about possible harmful outcomes only. Now, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but there may be application areas where one is better. I care about the process, and others where the outcome needs to be regulated. This and that shall not happen. And I think those are the discussions that we need to engage in at this point.
Thank you for that. And yeah, you're getting into the sort of thorny questions about regulation on sort of a global scale. And just to note that we're expecting new regulation to drop on artificial intelligence from the European Commission on 21st of April. So we'll see what happens then. We are moving into the Q&A part of the event. So if you have not already, please put your questions into the Q&A chat box. And I'm going to start with a question from Ayana. Yes, we will be able to share the link of the webinar later. We'll put this up on our YouTube channel of the NYU Center for Responsible AI. And also of course, the consulate will be able to circulate this as well. Then we have a question for Avi, but this is for everybody, from Susanne Tollmeyer. People are not always aware when they are in fact interacting with AI or have incorrect assumptions on what AI is and what it can do. So there are two questions now. One, how can we increase people's awareness of existing interactions with AI and its abilities? And then maybe somebody else can take the second question. What are the most important things we should teach people about interacting with AI? Avi, why don't you take the first one? How can we increase people's awareness of existing interaction with AI and its abilities?
Right. So I think we are getting to one of the core issues of AI, which is the definition of artificial intelligence to some degree, or one of the definitions of what it is to be artificial intelligence, is that humans cannot distinguish it from human action. So at the very core of the definition of what AI does is the ability to some degree to deceive a human being that it is an AI, right? So that is part of what the definition is about. So what can we do to change that? I guess, one discussion would be, should we label it? Should we say you're interacting with a human, you're interacting with an AI? Because otherwise, it will always be kind of a cops and robbers game, where, excuse the expression, where on one side, the one side will try and make AR smarter to make it more difficult to differentiate from a human being. And on the other side, you want to, increase the AI or a system that will be able to distinguish between a human and a machine. So we're not going to get out of this. I think what's core at this is that we need to work with all the digital literacy approaches that were mentioned for people to understand that all this interaction with AI that we're having, or what AI is doing, it's not necessarily what's often happening when you see a report about AI. The screen turns dark, you get the dark music. It's not necessarily a sinister technology by design, but at the core of it often lie very simple mechanisms that we have on a daily basis. I think kind of learning about these mechanisms will be at the core, differentiating between when I'm interacting with an AI and when I'm not. I think that is actually going to be one of the main questions for legislation.
I want to chime in a minute on this idea of notification. I think notification is great, to be honest, because it is one step towards developing agency, and literacy is just awareness. So as a really great example, the city of New York currently has a bill that is being discussed about instituting not only audits for automated decision-making systems used in hiring, but also notification. I think there's a lot of discussion around the audit part, completely understandably, but also I think the notification part of it is very, very critical. People are not aware how, and not even just that an algorithmic decision-making system is used in their hiring process, but actually how many of them are used. So one important thing to think about is, like, an interaction with an AI system is not as simple as, going on Spotify and then you have your recommendation. Sometimes it can be a little bit more complex. Like I apply, a recruiter reached out to me about a job, but they are aware that I exist because the company with a job posting hired this organization that uses an AI-based system to match text to identify potential candidates. Now that is a very specific and interesting and way upstream use of an AI system that actually does impact my life, but not in the direct one-to-one sense I think that people understand. So, I don't want to downplay the role of notification because at the very least, it is a first step in getting people to start asking the right kinds of questions.
Thank you so much, Ruman, for that excellent example. And we all know that these sort of systems of AIs that are folded into one another are really interesting. Oscar, you wanted to chime in as well, and then we'll move on to a bunch of other questions that have popped up.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to change is where it lies, where the responsibility lies for knowing these things. And I think one of the challenges of the things I wouldn't frame that way in the questions is, how do you teach? And I think that is not the question. I think from a government perspective, it is our responsibility to know what are the trade-offs that residents are placed into. And it is a responsibility to then inform people about those trade-offs and then represent what are the types of trade-offs that they're comfortable with experiencing and that they're not comfortable with experiencing. And I think then the conversation, one of the things that we need to do better is that how do we generate the spaces to have those conversations about what people are losing, or what is the potential of the consequences of the data that is being collected of them, and then take action based on what they want us to do.
Thank you for that, Oscar. I appreciate that you introduced the language of loss and of extraction here. I think that's very important to bring into the conversation. I want to move on to the next question, which I would love to ask Mignana from Dieter Chan, who's saying or asking how to deal with the fears coming from AI. In the federal administration, we tried to build an AI competence network, and had to realize that there are a lot of underlying fears, how to address them best.
Very good question. I think, yeah, it's a huge question. And so it starts at the very basic level at the schools, of course, but then I believe, as I just said, there needs to be more public debate, more democratic, inclusive discussions around AI. And I think there are a lot of myths around AI. What AI could do? Of course, from the movies we know, some kind of science fiction ideas. And I believe that when we address these fears directly, and then the question of who should address it, it's a collective effort. And I believe it's also our leaders, actually, so the decision makers, they should be a role model and also educate themselves and show or being literate as well on these questions. And then, of course, it's a multi-stakeholder dialogue that needs to take place. So it cannot be top down. It needs also to be bottom up. So it's an effort going in both directions. So from the civil society, but also on the top, we need to have people who are educated and literate about all these questions.
Thanks, Juliana. Yeah, that's kind of a question of distributed sort of responsibility at the end of the day, right? How do we get everybody sort of on the same page so we can have these kinds of conversations? Also use vocabularies that are appropriate, as Oscar mentioned earlier. Last question for today is for Ruman. Do you see an increase or a decrease in the tension between human and machine agency in the future?
That is such a great question. One of the pillars I'm trying to tackle in my new role is this idea of user agency. And just to maybe give a bit of a background, Jack Dorsey, Twitter CEO, when he was in front of Congress, said that we're working on something called algorithmic choice. And that's so interesting. It's such a fascinating concept to think about, but also it is not my job just to think about it. I have to drive it into practice. So I'll put it in one sense, very traditionally, I think a lot of folks have alluded to this, the narrative around AI systems are that they are better than us, they can handle more than we can, they don't need to sleep, etc. So even just by our languaging around it, we have set up a power dynamic where it is, quote, better than us. And then there's constantly these articles where we're surprised that AI systems are falling short. So I think, step one is this re-envisioning or reshaping of what an AI system is. And I think we're actually on a really positive path to kind of, even in changing some of the languaging, like I try to use algorithmic decision-making systems more. I think it demystifies this fancy movie language around AI. But then also, do I see increasing tensions? I think we see increasing awareness. And I think because we're seeing increasing usage and adoption, that has largely gone unfettered. And I think that people are becoming smarter, and as they become smarter, they ask smarter questions. And it's not just sort of the quote general public. We've also seen a marked arc in journalism around this. If we go back to when I started my role at Accenture in 2017, I actually used to have a slide at the beginning of all of my talks where I would say there are 3 things I do not talk about. I do not talk about Terminator, I do not talk about HAL, and I do not talk about Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, quote, saving the world. And I had to put that slide because those are the things I did not want to talk about. I wanted to talk about human empowerment, human agency, et cetera. I will say that fast forward, no reputable journalist writing about artificial intelligence invokes HAL or has a picture of Elon Musk in an Iron Man suit anymore. And it's great to have seen that education. So I know one theme in this whole narrative has been around digital literacy. I think that's been such an important part, is the different roles, the different actors who have been informing the public and how people are getting smarter. So I guess I have a complicated answer to the question where I don't know if it's attention as much as it's an awareness and education, and that people are asking smarter and smarter questions, which is a really wonderful thing to see.
And that is such a great note to sort of end on with this conversation today. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Oscar, Avi, Ninyana, and Ruman today. Thank you so much for coming into this space. Also, a sincere thanks to Rosina, Maria, Steve, and Emily, who have been, backstage and putting all of this together, as well, of course, to Dean Kovacevic and Ambassador Berlin. It was a real pleasure and honor to be here. We will continue the conversation, actually. We will be back on April 13th, and we will talk about AI and sustainability and ask if AI can be a tool for saving our planet. Until then, everybody, please stay safe. Enjoy the spring that is finally coming, at least to New York City. And it was such a pleasure to share the space with you. And a big thanks, of course, to our attendees as well. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that you will be back on April 13th. Thank you so much, everybody, and take good care.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you.
Thank you.